Hello. Sorry about that. I think the connection was a bit funny. Is everybody still there? If you can hear me, just give us a quick hi, and then we can get started with some of these questions. Good. Hello. All right. So I think we can start then. So thank you to everybody who sent in questions. Some of them have been building up over the week, and that's great. I just write them down and deal with them on the Friday. So the first question is about the Prokofiev Sinatra again. It's quite a popular topic of discussion. So we did once about the repeated notes, the E's, triple tonguing. So that's one technical aspect that we have to deal with in that piece. The other one is this lovely bit here. Hello. Don't know if you can see that. All those runs up to top D. And so thank you to Diane for her question. She was asking whether I had any tips about doing that run up to the top D and getting the top D to sound at all. So top D, it does seem like a tricky note, but if you practice it with real care to how you're directing your air and your air speed, so doing all the things that we've been doing with octaves and how fast we blow, hey there, we shouldn't have such a problem with it. It's just because we don't perhaps practice it as much as the other notes. And so I would suggest incorporating it into your practice of scales and arpeggios, not for all of them, but at least do some top Ds if you can during your practice session, just so that it's not that scary thing that we only do with Prokofiev or something. So dealing with that run though, we can all try this. So if you just analyze what that run is, it's just an augmented fifth triad thing. So made up of two major thirds. So we have G flat, B flat, and D natural. Okay, so you could either think of that as D, G flat, B flat, or D, F sharp, A sharp, both of which are the augmented triad there. So instead of, let's say, a D major arpeggio, it's going to be raising that fifth. So firstly, there's a couple of things that I would do. Firstly, I would practice the major third intervals and the other interval. So if we all do this together, and actually we'll do it against the wall as well and incorporate another exercise over there just so that we're all doing something. But firstly, just play all of the Ds and the F sharps that are in that triad in all your range, except top D for now because it's just going to be a bit too loud. So let's just try that. So it'll be, before we go to the wall, just going to do all three of those. So let's go to the wall. And I hope you can hear me. So we've got the contact of the shoulders, contact of the bum against the wall, head not against the wall like this, because that's pushing your head back, just straight up. And then you just let the knees go forward, bend them, and you slide down the wall. And you don't have to go all the way down like this, because that's going to hurt your knees if you've got joint issues and things, but just the slightest drop so that you'll unlock your knees. And you'll notice that your habits of leaning forward towards your flute are much more noticeable now because you've got that support of the wall. So really feel your shoulders against the wall and try not to let them leave, and don't let the bum leave as well. So let's try those notes. Coming back down. Good, now the next two will be F sharp and A sharp. And then we'll do D natural and A sharp. Okay. So that's a little good exercise you can do, and you'll notice that when you do that against the wall, your breathing gets a lot easier, and the sound just really is right there. I do recommend doing a little bit of bending the knees, sliding down the wall, and just blowing from there. And so for me, I could always tell when something difficult comes up with the fingers, I can feel my head going forward. It's just an automatic bad habit, and I'm sure a lot of you have the same or similar things. So you might feel it in the hands, you might feel the shoulders coming away. So use your wall as something to lean into and really feel that support. And then when you stand away from the wall, you can imagine it's there. And so you'd start to feel where you come out of that sort of alignment. Good. So it's just getting used to also with this run, you can't use the B flat thumb because you've got a G flat there. So if you put a thumb B flat on for that one, it's going to squeak the top G flat. So we've got to get used to using long B flat. So make sure that that's part of your practice. For top D, I just put the C key down. If you've got a B foot with the gizmo thing, you can do that, but that's quite a shift from the A sharp or the B flat to go over there. So I just don't do that. And if it's particularly sharp, instead of the C key, you could try the E flat key. That often helps bring the pitch down, and it sounds a bit less bright. So that's the first stage, is to just get used to the sound, how to blow, and put some top Ds in there as well. Okay, the next one is using slightly modified one of, if everybody's got this book, it's quite a good book, it's Gams and Arpeggi, Scales and Arpeggios, 480 Exercises by Marcel Moyes. And these are really good because they're all in triplets or sixes, and so it encourages a little bit more flow to your scale passages. Often in duplets, it gets a little bit sort of stuck in the mud, but with triplets, there's always a bit of a flow. And the Prokofiev is in triplets anyway, so it's good. He doesn't have the augmented triad here, but I'm on page 6 and 7, around exercise 147. But you can just put the accidentals in, so you can see at the bottom he's got D, F and A. So you just put in an F sharp and an A sharp, or if you look at over the page, there's one with D and G. You can do, and B, G, G flat and B flat. So you can practice it on either of those. Just put your own accidentals in. And it's really good because it just gets you up to that top bit. It's practicing the triplet run, but in gradual stages. So it would be... etc. until you get to the top. So you could practice that run like that. So that's what I would try, and then the exercise before that is in smaller chunks, which is another good thing about that book. So you can just practice etc. So you're just doing smaller chunks and you eventually get up. And then he doesn't have a... You can just practice it up to top D. So you just play it up the octave twice and you'll get up to the top D. And in the other exercise, you can extend it to a top D because it only goes up to an A. So try that for those runs. And with the top D, it's just an extension from the A sharp or the B flat. You'll just have to lift your air even more. So draw forward. And I think if you're not getting it out, there's an element of squeezing that might be going on with the lips, or your hands are getting tight and something's getting in the way of that free air, and the air has to be super fast up there. So if something's getting in the way and stopping that, it's not going to help you get the top D out. So I hope that helps with that run. So thank you to Diane for that. Second question, also if you have questions based on what I just said, please feel free to ask me. Second question comes from Cher in America, and I know Cher because I taught her in Canada, and she asked about intonation, what kind of things to practice so that when you play a piece of music and listen back to it, you don't get depressed by the intonation that's resulting in the performance. So to practice intonation, the first thing I would say is to find out if your flute is set up to its best balanced position, so that your harmonics are in tune. So that involves the head joint position. So how far out or pushed in are you? And everybody is different with this because of how they blow. So just because your teacher or somebody you know plays with the head joint pulled out like that, it doesn't mean that's going to work for you. It doesn't work for me that far out because it would just sound really flat. And likewise, some people might be pushed in more. So it does vary, and it varies on what kind of flute that you have. and head joint. So you always have to sort of do a little checkup, I think, before you practice. And this is the exercise that I learnt from Wib, who developed the Bennett scale, which a lot of flutes are now built with. So he really knows about intonation. And so this is just a simple check. Is to play low C and get the harmonic out by doubling the airspeed, and then comparing that with a normal C. And you're not going to change anything with your blowing. So once you get to that harmonic, you switch to normal C and listen really carefully to whether they're exactly the same. Because if they're not, that means your flute's a bit out of balance. And so if your head joint, if the real C is sharp, you will need to pull the head joint out. If the real one is flat, you'll need to push the head joint in a bit. Okay, so I'll show you the extreme examples so that you can hear, and maybe you can try. So just pulling the head joint way out, play a low C. So you can hear that's super flat. All right, so that means the head joint is pulled out too far. And so if you have, and it will affect these notes more than your right hand notes. So if you're finding that you're particularly flat around C, B in the left hand, and then it's not so noticeable in your right hand notes, it's possible that you've pulled out too much. So let's check the other extreme. So you push the head joint all the way in, so there's no gap there. Do the same thing. So you can hear that that's quite a lot sharper. So if that's the case, pull the head joint out. So it's going to be somewhere in between those two, and it just takes a while to find exactly a bit of fine tuning, but don't do it with the lips, only do it with the head joint. So it's the equivalent of a violin fine tuning their strings. You do the extreme one, it's like the peg, and then the fine tuning little screw things is what you do to really find the perfect pitch. Okay, so for me it's about here, so let's just see if that's the same. So it's about the same there. Okay, so I will just spend a couple of minutes just finding that for that day. It might be different because of the weather and things. So if it's a particularly cold day, you'll be a little bit flatter until you've warmed the instrument up. And so constantly you might have to keep checking that throughout the day. But it only takes a couple of minutes. And then once you've done C, you try C sharp as well. And on a lot of flutes, C sharp is a dodgy note. So you get to know, once your C is in tune, if the C sharp is really out, then you have to do a little compromise, but you'll know that how far the C sharp is out of center, and you can then adjust accordingly when you play it normally in scales and in pieces. Okay, so that's the first thing about intonation, is the head joint position. Get that right. Then it's a case of a lot of students will play and they'll sound great for the first minute, but then once they start using their fingers and they're going into the low register or into the high register, this might happen. So your flute might roll in, or a lot of people cover too much for the higher notes, and forget to lift the airstream, so the intervals going up to high notes sound a little squished, and so the top notes sound flat. And that's understandable that you don't want to lift, because higher notes tend to get sharper. But that's usually because we're overblowing or getting tight, causing tension, and all that tension just makes the sound, it makes it sharper. So if you can be more open, relaxed, released of tension, but continue to blow with good airspeed and in the right direction upwards for the high notes, you won't be sharp. And if your head joint's in the right position, that will also help that one. So try not to let your flute roll about. That's something you just have to observe in the mirror or record yourself, because some people just aren't aware that they're doing it. But even the slightest little movement makes quite a big difference to the blowing angle. You see, so I'm not moving the flute that much, but that can cause quite a substantial pitch change. So that's point number 2 about intonation. And Cher actually sent me a little clip of her playing, and what I noticed mostly was the use of air and ends of phrases in particular. So not allowing those to go flat. So as you get to the end of a phrase, you've got to think of the airspeed still. Keep blowing out. Just because it's a diminuendo, it doesn't mean you stop blowing out. That might sound quite obvious, but sometimes it's easy to forget to blow. You're just blowing a bit less, that's all, and you're guiding the air up, and you make sure that the airspeed remains fast enough. Okay, so before you breathe, you want to make sure that that airspeed continues all the way to the next breath. So that's what I would suggest for intonation stuff. If you have any, we might do another warm-up on intonation purely, if that would be of interest. Please do comment that would be something of interest. The third question comes from Teresa, and it's on Mozart. And so when we did the Mozart G major concerto, she asked, should I single or double tongue it? And this is what she said: it's because the character of single tonguing and double tonguing for her is different. So I don't think you need to double tongue it, and I think you can have more control with single tonguing. However, saying that, I would say to practice single and double tonguing so that it doesn't dictate the character or the sound that you're making. So it doesn't matter what tongue stroke you use, whether it's a t, k, d, g, p, you need to make sure that you can still create the music that you want to with any of those tongue strokes. And some tongue strokes will be easier to do certain characters, and you can use that to your advantage as well. So if you want something very light, you might use something more forward in the tongue. If you want something a little heavier, you might use something further back and with a heavier sound. But make sure that when you practice articulation that you practice both the t and the k with the sound that you want to create and with the character you want to create. So practice the Mozart single-tongued, double-tongued, no tonguing, all slurred, just on a h, and make sure that you've got all of those tools, but you're not letting them dictate to you what the character of the music is, if that makes sense. just like with a violin player, just because you've got an up bow, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. It can be lighter. It obviously helps with that. You can play much lighter with an up bow, but if you need to use down bow and up bow in a piece, and you want it all to sound in one character, you need to make sure that you can play them equally. So that's the same with the tongue. I often think of the bow as something that we can think of with airstream and articulation. So that's how I would approach that for Mozart. I hope that helps. Question number 4 comes from Lindsay. Thank you for your question. So it's about making the air more dynamic, more vibrant. And this is about releasing your air, how you release your air. So something that we can all try, we've done some breathing exercises in some of the first videos. So that gives you a good idea of how to release air. So let's just try a little bit of a breathing exercise where we breathe in for 4 beats every time, but we are going to go from 12 out for 12, then we'll breathe in again for 4, then we'll be out for 8, then breathe in again, out for 4, breathe in again, out for 2, breathe in again, out for 1. Okay, so it's 12, 8, 4, 2, 1. Let's try that. So I'll talk us through it as we go. So in for 4. Now blow out gradually, 12. In for 4. Now out for 8. Use all your air. In for 4. Use all your air now, out for 4. In for 4. All your air out for 2. And in for 4. Out for 1. Okay, so that is a good exercise in learning how you release your air. And obviously you can do more than 12, but it's a good thing to sort of go between maybe doing a 2, going back to 14, do a 2 again, do an 8, like mix it up, as long as you know so whilst you're breathing in, okay, I'm going to do 8, then use all your air throughout the 8. So don't use it all in 2 beats, and by the time you get to 8, don't have any sort of leftover air. Don't save it, because you're going to get more air back. It's free. Okay, so that's the one thing that's free in life is air, and you can just keep replacing it. So keep using your air freely, and that will give you the release of air and the dynamic air that will produce a sound which is really exciting and free and open. And that's just not to be confused with overblowing. So when you play a phrase and you want it to sound more exciting, it's not a case of just like blowing at it in any old way. So if you want to create something with a very big sound, you can think of the red flames of a fire. So that's very visible, and but it's not it's just very open as well. And you can think of like opening the floodgates and all the water's just flowing out. So you make space for all that air to come out. But when you're playing pianissimo, for example in the Don John study, at the beginning it's piano or pianissimo, I can't remember, but soft anyway. And can think of that as being like the white hot embers of a fire. So it's still burning, there's still something there, the airspeed is there, and you've got energy behind the sound. So yeah, it's like also Michel de Bost said it's like a stage whisper. So it's got to have that delivery and excitement even in the very soft dynamic. So another exercise we can try together is if we breathe and we're going to cover our mouth and blow against it, and then you just release your hand but still blowing, so it'll be like doing that. Okay, so let's try that together. So you send the air out, breathing in, blow out on your hand against your mouth, and take it away. One more time. Okay, so that's another exercise of releasing air, and that's something I learned from Lorna McGee. And if you want to learn from somebody, from listening to their playing, about how they use their air, she's perfect example. So I recommend listening to her playing. Yep, so that's that one. I hope that makes sense. When you have very soft passages and pieces, practice it fortissimo and practice it 3 harmonics higher, so that you're getting the airspeed and you're getting that delivery of air, free air, and then straight after play it in the register and at the dynamic, but keep that in mind, keep the airspeed in mind, and keep that freedom of air and release of air, and that will give you a more exciting pianissimo. So I hope that helps. Someone, Diane again, asked about flutter tonguing, and I will probably do that next week as part of a warm-up. It's not something I really do that often, but I do like some scales flutter tonguing, and it does help. So we can do that next week. I think I had another question. Yeah, one more question. Phrasing. This came from Lucy. And she said, how do you phrase properly? And just the wording of that, I mean, yes, there are wrong ways to phrase, but it doesn't mean that there's only one right way. So if I said you have to phrase it like that, I'm not being a good teacher, because I'm saying this is the only way to phrase. But there are certain sort of grammar points, if you like, about phrasing, particularly about meter. So we have a 1, 2, 3, 4. We have the stress patterns of different time signatures which we should observe, especially in Baroque music and classical music, where that's very present. Dance feeling that we need to get from those meters, coming away at the ends of phrases and cadence points, how we go towards strong harmonies, and then how the sound is released from that. So you might have a dissonant chord and then it resolves, so we need to show that with the dynamic or the colour or the vibrato, and then release, and how you aim towards that point. That is certain things which are a sort of given about phrasing. How you phrase, how you get to the top of a phrase, you can use multiple things, and for example changing the vibrato speed and depth, changing the dynamic, changing the colour of the sound, and all of those things you can practice with the Moyes 24 studies, because they're very simple, for the fingers at least, and you can really work on how you build phrases. So that's something I'd recommend. And she also asked about how to play long lines, how to keep the music in a long line. And you often hear that from conductors or something like, this is a long line, you need to make longer lines. And when I was younger, I was just like, what do you mean? And so I've discovered really through my own playing, it's not, as flute players we have to breathe, and so there's no getting around that. We can circular breathe if we want, but I think it's not such a problem to breathe. It's something that we do, and it's composers know we need to breathe. And if we turn it into a positive and using our breath to ignite the sound and sustain the sound and show those moments of stress and release, and how we use our air can make something so exciting or sad, and we can do all sorts of emotions with our airstream. Playing for long phrases and sustaining the tension in the harmony or in the music, that's something that you have to feel, and not letting go of the sound perhaps too soon. So sustaining the colour until it reaches its natural end. And that also means when you're breathing, not to let the phrases drop between when you breathe. So it's imagining sort of phrasing over the breath, but you can still do that and breathe. That's definitely possible, and that's how you can sustain a longer line in music, is to keep thinking of the phrase even with the breath, so not letting the sound drop completely and then having to restart, but really thinking forward with the phrase. So that's what I would say with phrasing. There's no definite right answer, this is how you phrase, but you can learn some of the basic points, really listen to the harmonies and the piano part, never study a piece just on the flute part, because you really need to understand where the composer wants the music to go to, what characters he wants or she wants. So yeah, that's another thing I would suggest. Use the whole score. And listen to lots of people playing recordings. There's so many out there, and listen to all their different ideas. And some of them you'll agree with, some of them you won't agree with, and that's fine, because everybody's different. So that I don't keep waffling on, I think that's a good place to close the questions, and we probably have reached the end of today's video. So I'll do the Moyes number 2, 24 studies number 2 next week, and I hope you have a good weekend. I will read the chat later in case I've missed something, because it comes up on the phone and then it sort of goes away, so apologies if I haven't answered one of your questions. Okay, so have a good weekend and see you on Monday.